Chapter 10, Dynastic Changes. The Italian War. The crisis of 1857 did not develop into a proletarian revolution as Marx and Engels had hoped. But it was certainly not without revolutionary effects, even though they took the form of dynastic changes only. The United Kingdom of Italy arose, and a little later the United German Empire, whilst the old French Empire disappeared. This course of events resulted from the double fact that the bourgeoisie never fights its own revolutionary battles, and that, since the Revolution of 1848, it had grown unwilling to let the proletariat fight them for it. The trouble was that in this revolution, and in particular in the June struggles in Paris, the proletariat had abandoned its old custom of letting itself be used merely as cannon fodder for the bourgeoisie, and had demanded a share of the fruits of the victories which were won with its own blood and heroism. As a result, even in the revolutionary years, the cunning idea occurred to the bourgeoisie of persuading some power other than the increasingly mistrustful and unreliable proletariat to snatch its chestnuts out of the fire. This was particularly the case in Germany and in Italy, that is to say, those countries where for the moment the chief task presented by historical development was the creation of a national state such as capitalist forces of production require for their fullest development. The obvious solution of the problem was to offer one of the princelings the hegemony over the whole country in return for his promise to grant the bourgeoisie the elbow room it needed for the full development of capitalist exploitation. However, this plan compelled the bourgeoisie to abandon its own political ideals and content itself with the satisfaction of its bald profit interests, for by calling in the aid of the princes, it subordinated itself to princely domination. Even in the revolutionary years, therefore, the bourgeoisie began to flirt with the princely states, and with the most reactionary ones at that. In Italy it was the Kingdom of Sardinia, that military Jesuit statelet in which, in the bitter words of the German poet, both priest and mercenary sucked the people dry. And in Germany it was the Kingdom of Prussia, which was under the thumb of obscurantist East Helvian Junkerdom. At first the bourgeoisie was unsuccessful both in Italy and in Germany. King Albert of Sardinia did consent to make himself the sword of Italy, it is true, but on the battlefield he was defeated by the Austrian army and died a fugitive on foreign soil. Prussia Frederick William IV rejected the German Kaiser crown offered him by the German bourgeoisie, for he considered it a purely illusory honor, a crown baked of mud and clay. Instead he preferred a little body snatching at the expense of the revolution, though he failed woefully in this, less on account of the Austrian sword than the Austrian whip in all mitts. However, the industrial prosperity which had sapped the strength of the revolution in 1848 became a powerful lever for the furtherance of bourgeois interests in Italy and Germany. And in both these countries it made national unity more urgent and necessary than ever. In 1857, the crisis broke out and reminded the bourgeoisie of the evanescence of all capitalist glory, but at last things began to move, first in Italy. Not that this must be taken as an indication that capitalist development had proceeded further in Italy than in Germany. On the contrary, large-scale industry did not exist at all in Italy, and therefore the antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat had not yet developed to the extent of awakening mutual distrust. No less important was the fact that Italy's disunity was the result of foreign dominance, and that it was the common aim of all classes of society to overthrow this dominance. Austria ruled directly over Lombardy and the province of Venice, and indirectly over central Italy, whose little courts took their orders from the Vienna Hofburg. A struggle against the foreign yoke had been proceeding in Italy for 20 years without a break, and it had led to brutal measures of repression on the one hand and desperate reprisals on the other. The Italian stiletto was the inevitable answer to the Austrian scourge. However, all the terrorism, the insurrections and the conspiracies proved useless against the superior power of the Habsburgs. And even in the revolutionary years the Italian insurrections all failed. The promise that Italy should win its own independence proved to be a delusion. Italy needed outside assistance in order to throw off the Austrian yoke, and therefore it turned to its sister nation, France. The maintenance of national disunity in Italy and Germany was a traditional principle of French foreign policy. But the adventurer who sat on the throne of France was prepared to bargain about the matter. The Second Empire was a farce so long as it was confined within the frontiers drawn for France by the European powers after the overthrow of the First Empire. France needed territorial conquests, but the false Bonaparte was unable to make them as the real one had done. The false Bonaparte had to content himself with borrowing the so-called nationality principle from his alleged uncle and presenting himself in the role of the messiah of the oppressed nations. Naturally always on condition that his friendly services were generously rewarded in the way of land and population. At the same time his whole situation was such that he could not take many risks. He was not in a position to wage a European war, not to speak of a revolutionary war, and the utmost he could do was belabor the scapegoat of Europe with the condescending permission of the other powers. At the beginning of the 50s the scapegoat had been Russia, but by the end of them it was Austria. The shameful regime maintained by the Austrian intruders in Italy had developed into a European scandal, whilst at the same time the House of Habsburg had quarrelled with its old partners of the Holy Alliance, with Prussia on account of Olmütz and with Russia on account of the Crimean War. In fact, Bonaparte was quite certain of Russian assistance in case he should attack Austria. The internal situation of France urgently demanded some foreign political action in order to bolster up Bonapartist prestige. The commercial crisis of 1857 had paralyzed French industry, and thanks to the maneuvers with which the government had tried to prevent its outbreak, the evil had become chronic. And French trade had lain stagnant for years. As a result both the bourgeoisie and the proletariat were becoming rebellious, whilst even the peasantry, the chief prop of the coup d'état regime, were beginning to grumble. The big drop in grain prices which took place from 1857 to 1859 caused the peasants to declare that, owing to the low prices they obtained for their produce and the heavy burdens on agriculture, the tilling of the soil was rapidly becoming impossible. In this situation Bonaparte was zealously courted by Cavour, the chief minister of the Kingdom of Sardinia. This man had taken up the tradition of King Albert, but he pursued his policy with incomparably greater skill. Still, with only the impotent methods of diplomacy at his disposal, he made little progress because the brooding and undecided character of Bonaparte made it difficult for him to take any rapid decision. However, the Italian party of action took a hand in the game and as a result the champion of freedom was compelled to make up his mind quickly. On the 14th of January, 1858, Orsini and his accomplices flung their bombs at the imperial carriage, which was hit by no less than 76 fragments. The occupants of the carriage were not injured, but as is usually the way with such characters the false Bonaparte answered the attempt by establishing a reign of terror. However, the very fury with which he did so indicated that his regime, which had now lasted 7 years, was in reality based on a very unstable foundation. Whilst a letter which he received from Orsini during the latter's imprisonment gave him a new shock of fear. Remember, declared Orsini, that the peace of Europe and your own peace of mind will remain purely chimerical so long as Italy has not achieved its independence. Orsini is said to have spoken still more plainly in a second letter. During the erratic wanderings of his adventurous life Bonaparte had once fallen in with Italian conspirators and he was well aware that their vengeance was not a thing to be trifled with. In the summer of 1858, therefore, he invited Cavour to meet him in Plombières where the two arranged a little war on Austria. Sardinia was to receive Lombardy and the province of Venice and to constitute itself the kingdom of Upper Italy, and in return it was to grant Savoy and Nice to France. It was a diplomatic bargain which fundamentally had little to do with the freedom and independence of Italy, and no mention was made of central and southern Italy. Though no doubt both parties had their own ideas on the subject, Bonaparte was unwilling to abandon the traditional French foreign policy and further the unification of Italy. On the contrary, he wished to maintain the temporal power of the papacy and create a league of Italian dynasties which could be played off against each other, thus securing French hegemony. In addition he harbored the idea of creating a kingdom of central Italy for his cousin Jerome. Cavour, on the other hand, reckoned with the development of a powerful national movement which would permit him to hold all dynastic and particularist tendencies in check once Upper Italy had been forged into a strong state. On New Year's Day, 1859, Bonaparte received the Austrian ambassador in audience and informed him of the French intentions. Whilst a few days later the King of Sardinia announced to the world that he was not deaf to the heart-rending appeals of the Italian people. These threats were perfectly understood in Vienna and the outbreak of hostilities approached rapidly. whilst the Austrian government was clumsy enough to let itself be maneuvered into the role of attacker. Half bankrupt, attacked by France and threatened by Russia, it was in a difficult position, and the lukewarm friendship of the English Tories was not of very much assistance. So it therefore sought to win the support of the German League. The League was not bound by any agreement to defend the non-German possessions of any of its members. But the Austrian government hoped to inveigle it into doing so with the politico-military slogan that the Rhine must be defended along the Po, or in other words, it tried to persuade the League that the maintenance of Austrian oppression in Italy was a matter of vital national importance for Germany. Since the outbreak of the crisis in 1857, a national movement had also developed in Germany, but it was different from the national movement in Italy, and the difference was not to its credit. The German national movement was not goaded on by the irritation of foreign domination, and in addition, since 1848 the German bourgeoisie had harbored a lively horror of the proletariat, although the latter had not really proved so dangerous after all. Nevertheless, the Paris June days represented an awful warning. Up to 1848, France had been the ideal of the German bourgeoisie, but after that it had turned to England for stimulus. A country in which the bourgeoisie and the proletariat seemed to be able to compose their differences peaceably. The marriage of the Prussian crown prince to an English princess had caused an ecstasy of delight amongst all good German bourgeois. And when the mentally defective King of Prussia handed over the reins of government to his brother in the autumn of 1858, and the latter appointed a tame liberal ministry, for reasons which were anything but liberal, bovine coronation rejoicings, as Lassalle called them bitterly, burst out. In order not to irritate the Prince Regent, the noble bourgeoisie disavowed its own heroes of 1848 and, instead of protesting when the new ministry left things practically as they were before, it adopted the famous slogan, "Gently does it," for fear of arousing the displeasure of the new ruler, who might then sweep away the new era, which existed only at his whim like a shadow on a wall. As the clouds of war gathered, the national wave began to rise higher in Germany. The way in which Cavour was working for Italian unity was very tempting to the German bourgeoisie, which had long ago chosen Prussia to play the role of Sardinia. But the attack of Germany's hereditary enemy, France, on Germany's ally, Austria, caused misgivings in the breast of the German bourgeoisie and awakened unpleasant memories. Perhaps the false Bonaparte intended to revive the traditions of the real one. Perhaps the days of Austerlitz and Jena would return and the chains of foreign domination again rattle in Germany. The journal in the pay of the Austrian government scribbled for all they were worth to convince the German bourgeoisie of the reality of its fears. And at the same time they drew an idyllic picture of a Central European great power under the leadership of Austria and embracing the German League, Hungary, the Slav and Romanian Danubian lands, Alsace-Lorraine, Holland and heaven knows what else. On the other hand, the false Bonaparte naturally let loose his ink-slingers also, and they swore by all the gods that their paymaster harbored no such evil thought as a desire to seize the banks of the Rhine, and that his attack on Austria was prompted solely by the most edifying considerations, to wit, the interests of European civilization. Naturally, the good German Philistine found it very difficult to form an opinion of his own in this welter of contradictory propaganda. But gradually he began to lend a more willing ear to the voice of the Habsburg charmer, to the detriment of the latter's Bonapartist rival. The arguments of the Habsburgers flattered his own pot-valiant patriotism, whilst at the same time it was asking rather much of anyone to believe in the civilizing mission of the false Bonaparte. For all that, however, the situation was so complicated that even men used to dealing with political intricacies, and revolutionaries at that, men who agreed absolutely on all fundamental questions, were unable to agree as to the practical policy which Germany should pursue towards the Italian war.